In the next video, you're going to be installing React Redux. It's a library that allows us to connect our Redux stores to our React components, and it makes heavy use of a pattern known as higher order components. So what I want to do in this video is explore these higher order components. We're going to be creating a few of our own, and we're going to see exactly what it takes to make one. That's going to make it way easier to use and actually understand what's happening when we use the React Redux library in the next video. So to kick this one off, we're just going to spend a little bit of time in a single file in the playground folder. We'll call this HOC for higher order component.js, and we're just going to take a quick moment to switch Webpack over to running that file. In the playground folder, we are going to run hoc.js. I'm going to save Webpack config, restart the terminal, and once the dev server is back up, we can switch over to the browser and we can switch back to the editor. So now we can actually get some stuff rendered to the screen using higher order components. Now I want to kick things off with a definition of a higher order component. Higher order component. And if you look around on a lot of articles online, you'll usually see HOC, the shorthand. So when you see HOC, just think higher order component. It is just a component, a regular old React component that renders another component. Now this might not seem very useful, but the way we're going to implement it is definitely unique as opposed to what we've been doing already in the course. So this component right here, this would be the higher order component. And the component that we actually render in the higher order component, this is just going to be a regular component. So we might have 5 or 6 of them that get rendered by the same higher order component. Now, this is one of those patterns that's very hard to understand until you actually see it in action. So I want to get into a real world example as quickly as possible. And we're going to go ahead and do that right now. To kick things off, we're just going to go through the usual process, creating a regular component, not using the higher order component pattern. So I'm going to import React, and I'm going to import React DOM, grabbing React DOM from the React-DOM library. And now we're going to make a very generic non-HOC component. So we'll just make something like info. It will be an arrow function, and we will implicitly return some JSX, and then we'll just render that to the screen. So I will provide a root div for this one. Inside of the div, we can provide a few other tags, maybe an h1 with info, and then a paragraph tag right here. The info is : space, and then we'll open up a JavaScript expression and just dump something like props.info. Up here, we name the props argument, and we're done. So we have this very simple component in place, nothing crazy here. This does not use the HOC pattern, but we can go ahead and render it to the screen with a call to React DOM.render. We are rendering an instance of the info component, and I am going to go ahead and provide that prop. I'll provide info, setting it equal to my information. I'll just say something like, this is the detail. Perfect. Or let's say these are the details. Now we have the component set up. I'm going to go ahead and just put it somewhere. That would be document.getElementById. We have that div with the ID of app, and there we go. We are all done. We have a very basic component set up. And if I save hoc.js, it shows up to the screen. So how do we introduce the higher order component pattern? Because this component, this is actually this part of the definition. So a component that renders another component. We have the other component in place, and we might have 7 or 8 of these, and we might want to use the same higher order component for all of them, allowing us to reuse code. So how are we going to get that done? Let's go ahead and create our very first higher order component. And for this example, let's say we're creating a medical application and we're showing a lot of privileged information to the user, and we want to make them aware when they're seeing private privileged information. So we want a way to take any component we might render and add an admin message just above it, saying something like, the information below is privileged, please don't share. Now, could we add this into every single component that makes up our application? Sure. But the goal of a higher order component is to reuse code. So we're going to be able to reuse code. We're going to be able to perform something called render hijacking. We're also going to be able to add a little bit of prop manipulation in. And lastly, we're going to be able to abstract state. So these are some of the big advantages of using the higher order component pattern. Let's go ahead and take a look at how we get that done. Step 1, we want to create a function. So I'm going to create a regular function, not a React component. So right here, I'll call this something along the lines of with admin warning. With admin warning is going to be a regular function, and it's actually going to get called with the component this one, that we want to wrap. So in our case, we might use this down below with admin warning, and I'll call it with the component that I want to wrap, info. And I could replace this with as many number of components as I wanted to, depending on how many I wanted to add the admin warning to. Now we are going to get something back, and what we get back from with admin warning, which we'll set up in a second, is actually going to be an alternative version of this component. It is going to be the higher order component. So I'm going to create a const. This is going to be a component, so we do have to follow the naming conventions, and I'll call this one something like admin info. So now I have this admin info component that I'm going to be able to use. Now, obviously, how do we get from this to this? Well, that's what we're going to explore right now. And step one is to be able to access the component that we're trying to wrap. So this gets passed in as the first argument. I'm going to name it up above. Now, I'm not going to call it info because with admin warning could be used on any number of components. The whole goal is to reuse code, so we're going to reuse this function. I'm going to stick to a generic name, and it's a common pattern to use wrapped component right here. Remember, it is a component, so we do want to start with the uppercase first letter. Now, inside of this function, this is where we return a new component. So the component we create right here, this is the higher order component. Mine's going to be a stateless functional component, and I will just implicitly return some JSX. Now, I am going to set up props. We'll use that in a few moments. And right here, what I'm going to do is return whatever I want to actually have the component render. So I'll start off with a root div. Now in this div, we have a few goals. The first goal is to add that admin warning in, and the second goal is to make sure we still render the wrapped component. Because remember, the whole goal is to display the message above the component we're wrapping. So I'm going to start off with that warning message. Right here, I will use a paragraph tag for that. And I'll say something like this is private info, please don't share. So we have our message in place. Now down below, this is where we actually want to render the regular component. So all I'm going to do is create an instance of it. I'm going to create an instance of wrapped component from up above. I can then go ahead and close this off, and there we have it. We have our very first higher order component. Now, how do we use this? Well, instead of rendering info, we just render admin info. So down below, instead of rendering info, I will render admin info. Remember, admin info is just this component. So what's going to happen? It is going to take the props, do nothing with them. It's going to render a div with the paragraph and the wrapped component, which in this case is the info component, and then info will show. So we'll have the h1 and the paragraph tag. If I save this file over inside of the browser, we're going to see just that. We have our admin message up above, and we have the info component down below. So this is our very first higher order component. It's going to allow us to reuse code, adding an admin message to as many other components as we like without needing this code in each of those components. Instead, we're going to be using the higher order component pattern. Now you'll notice that the info component currently is a little broken. It's not getting the props that are passed in right here. We can actually go ahead and fix that using the spread operator we've already explored. So when we're instantiating a component inside of JSX, we can actually open and close a set of curly braces to create a JavaScript expression, and we can spread out any given object we like. So I'm going to spread out props. Now this has the effect of taking every key value pair on that object and passing them down as props. So in this case, what props are getting into admin info? Just one. It is an object where info equals this string. We have access to that right here, and we spread it out right here. That means we're taking all of the props passed into this higher order component, and we're just passing them directly down to the child. This is a very useful technique. We're going to be using it quite a bit in more complex applications. So if I save the higher order component file, now what do we see? We see we're still getting our admin message, and all of the props are correctly getting passed down to the child. So we're still able to see there are the details printing to the screen. We can actually take this one step further by passing a special prop into the higher order component as well. So maybe we want to be able to provide whether or not we should show that message. Maybe we're going to have an is admin prop, and this is a Boolean. So if it's true, show the message. If it's not, don't show the message. And to set this up, we're actually just going to use patterns we already know about. So we're getting the prop passed into this component. which means we can access it right here. So I could take this paragraph and cut it out and use a little bit of conditional rendering. I'll use a JavaScript expression and the logical AND operator, which we've used previously in the course. So I'm going to check props.isAdmin. If it is indeed true, I'm going to render the paragraph I just had. Now, if I save the component like this, what are we going to get? We're not going to get that admin message because isAdmin is false. But if the data changes for some reason and they're now an admin or they log in, we're going to be able to show that message. By adding new props onto the higher order component, we create a higher order component that's even more reusable and versatile. We can also just pass things like isAdmin down. So we can create brand new props that we pass down to the info component, and they can choose to use them if they like. So we're going to be seeing this pattern extensively with the React Redux library. They are going to give us a function like this. We're going to be passing our components inside of them, and the end result is going to be a new component that we're going to be using. And this new component, it will have access to the Redux store. So before we go, I do want to go through the process of creating one more higher order component, and this is actually going to be your challenge for the video. The function that you're going to be creating is going to be called require authentication, and this will be similar to with admin warning. This is going to be the function that we call to generate the higher order component. Now, I will give you the usage down below. So once again, we are going to be calling the function. We're going to be calling require authentication. And we're going to be passing in the component we want to wrap, and what we get back is an enhanced version of that component. I'm going to call this one something along the lines of auth info. Now, we're going to be setting up auth info to either show the component when the user is authenticated or to show a message when they're not. Let's go ahead and play around with the usage down below. I'm going to take that line and duplicate it, and I will comment out the original one. And right here, we're going to go ahead and tweak this. Instead of rendering admin info, we will render auth info. And instead of isAdmin, we're going to have is authenticated. So is authenticated is going to be true when I should see the component. So in this case, I should see the info component showing up. It's going to be false when I shouldn't see that component. In this case, I just want to see a message like, please log in to view the info. Now, getting this done is going to be your challenge. So you're going to have to create the function that takes in the info component. You're going to have to return the new stateless functional component and add a little bit of conditional logic in there, checking whether or not is authenticated is true or false and responding accordingly. So take as much time as you need to get this one done. And I totally understand this is a new pattern and it might be a little tricky, but do give it an honest try, test your work, pause the video, and when you're done, click play. All right, let's go ahead and knock this one out. I'm going to kick things off by creating the function. So const require authentication, no way around that. And we're going to set it up to be an arrow function. Remember, this is not our higher order component. This is just a regular function that returns the higher order component. And right here, I am going to access the wrapped component. And down below, we are going to return the higher order component. So for our purposes, this can be another stateless functional component. We'll get the props in. We'll set up the arrow, and we will implicitly return some JSX. Now I can set up a root div, and now we're going to focus on the core functionality. So we want to look into props. If props.isAuthenticated is true, we're going to go ahead and show the wrapped component. If it's false, we're going to show a different message. And I can actually just use the ternary operator to get that done. So I'll check props.isAuthenticated. If it is true, right here, I will render one thing to the screen. If it is false, I will render something else. Now, for the truthy rendering, all I'm going to do is just render wrapped component. There's no need to add anything fancy in. Right here, wrapped component, and I will pass down any props from above. So I will spread those out using the spread operator, ... props. Now, what do I want to do if props.isAuthenticated is not true? Well, in that case, I'm just going to show a message to the screen. I could have used a paragraph tag. You might have used something else. Whatever you used, that's perfectly fine. And right here, I'll say something along the lines of, please log in to view the info. Perfect. So now we have our higher order component all set up. It is going to allow us to either hide or show the component based off of some value. Now, if I save this, we have isAuthenticated equal to false, so I should see my little warning message, and if I save the program, that is exactly what I get. Please log in to view the info. If I switch this value over to true, that message should go away, and I should just see the regular component, and here we have it. We now have the info component. This higher order component pattern is going to allow us to modify and change a series of existing components without having to rewrite this code a bunch of times. Instead, we've abstracted it away and we're able to reuse this as often as we need. In the next video, we're actually going to connect our React components to Redux. We're going to be using the exact same pattern we just explored, though instead of creating our own higher order component function, we'll be using one provided by a library. I am super excited to get to that, so let's go ahead and jump right in.